Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture for business writing. For this lecture, you should have read or at least skimmed chapters 1 and 4 of Business Writing for Success, the open access textbook from the syllabus. I say read or skimmed because these lectures are going to draw your attention to some of the most important parts of the textbook, but also kind of fill them in with my own understanding of the principles that are being presented. So as long as you're at least generally aware of what's going on in the textbook in this course, you'll be able to follow the lectures pretty well. And the more important part of that too is that most of the work in this course will be on the case studies that I present on Canvas and the reflections that you can write if you want to get into the B or A tier for the class. So that's where most of the work will happen. That's where you'll demonstrate that you understand these principles. And so be at least generally aware of what's going on in the text, but the readings are short and I'm going to keep these lectures pretty brief too, so that you have lots of time and space to do the assignments, of which I believe there are many. But here's our first lecture. Those chapters cover effective writing and effective business communication. So I'm going to cover them both in this lecture. The most important part of understanding good communication is understanding the rhetorical situation. You might have heard this discussed in your E110 course or any other course on English and literature. But our authors present an interesting way of looking at the rhetorical situation for business. They break it down into 8 parts. The source, who is the speaker. In this case, you can think of me as the source of this lecture, but you could also maybe think about the textbook and how I'm using that as a source for my information, or my own personal experience as a source for information. The second part that they discuss is the message, which I think you can break down really into 2 parts. There's the message as in the words themselves, or you can think about the message as the underlying meaning. And so I'm here discussing the rhetorical situation with these particular words, but maybe the underlying meaning is that, hey, I really want these students to be good business communicators. Next, they discuss the channel, which is the medium of communication. In this case, Zoom and YouTube and Canvas are how I deliver this message to you, and those affect what I can say and how I can say things and how I can present things. Next is the receiver, obviously the person who's hearing the message. In this case, you can think of yourself. This is where it starts to get unique for business. They start to talk about feedback. If you think about some of the other writing you've done in academia, which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment, the feedback is kind of just the grade you get on a paper. But in a business environment, the feedback can mean lots of things. It can mean the feedback you get from a boss that causes you to change your message, the feedback you get from somebody else that says, hey, present this on a different channel so I can see it. So feedback can take lots of different forms in business writing. Next, the authors ask us to think about the environment. I think this is an interesting way too to think about business writing. In academic writing, we don't maybe think about this as much, but when they say environment, they mean the literal physical space. So how does the chair I'm sitting in affect my message, the desk I'm using? How do these all change what I'm saying and how I say it? Context, we are more used to in academic settings. Context is sort of the history of what you're saying, the history of the institution, the history of the classroom, anything that surrounds what you're going to say in a more ideological sense instead of a physical sense. And then lastly, interference. This gets even more important as we think about the 21st century and the technologies we use to communicate, right? Because if I want to say something on Twitter, how much other stuff is out there that's maybe going to drain out my message? And so these are all parts of what our authors call the rhetorical situation. The one model I wanted to focus in on from the textbook is what they call the transactional model, which is illustrated by this sort of graphic up in the top right of this slide. But it basically gives a good depiction of business writing as I understand it. Basically, you have some source, yourself or me in this case, that's going to send a message to a bunch of receivers. And From that message, we're going to get a lot of feedback. In this case, I'm going to ask you to contribute to discussion boards on Canvas. And from that feedback, I'm going to develop new messages and new ways to think about how I deliver my message to the receiver. In the course of all this, we want to think about context, we want to think about channels, we want to think about interference, and we want to think about the environment that we're in. So I think this is a really great way of thinking about business writing. I've taken here 3 definitions actually of technical writing from Susan Last in an open access textbook that she wrote. But she writes of technical writing, and I think we can transfer it pretty accurately to business writing as well, that it is transactional, meaning in this case, it involves feedback and interference, the way that this graphic presents, but also that it involves some kind of economic exchange, right? If I'm a business writer, I have to think about how am I going to make money from my audience? Maybe if I'm working in a nonprofit, I have to think about my transactions with my supervisor, about how are we advancing the mission, and so on. It's audience-centered, which I want to get to in just a moment, meaning we really have to think more about our audience than ourselves in business writing, which might be a little bit different from some of the writing you've done so far in your classes. And lastly, Susan Last says that it's mundane or day-to-day. I put a question mark next to it. I think some forms of business writing are. If you think about emails as business writing, then those are definitely just kind of mundane day-to-day documents. But there are other kinds of business writing like open letters that happen infrequently, and so maybe stand out a little bit more from the day-to-day stuff. And so I said I want to return to this idea of audience-centered, and I'll do that right now. And this is where I think about business writing versus academic writing. So here's a quote from your textbook. Whenever you speak or write in a business environment, you have certain responsibilities to your audience, your employer, and your profession. When we think about academic writing, the responsibility is really to yourself. And the idea is, hey, am I presenting my opinion in a clear way that sort of gets through what I want to say? In business writing, it's a little bit different. Your responsibilities are first to your audience, right? If you're selling a product, am I selling an ethical product? Am I selling a usable product? Am I selling a worthwhile product? To your employer, again, if I'm selling a product, am I thinking about the bottom line of my employer? If you're in a nonprofit, again, am I advancing the mission of my employer? And how am I doing that in every piece of communication I produce? And your profession, if you're studying to be someone in marketing, then you want to think about how you're representing all marketers. If you're studying to be an engineer, you want to think about how am I representing all engineers in my writing? And I'll ask you to do that in your second Canvas discussion this week. So at the end of the day, they give us these rules for good business writing in the textbook. First, they say it follows the rules. Second, is easy to read. It attracts the reader. It meets the reader's expectations. It's clear and concise and is efficient and effective. And I tell you those 6 rules to get to what I call the heuristics dilemma. So those are 2 kind of big words, but heuristics are rules of thumb, or maybe more accurately, kind of loose rules toward getting toward a solution, and dilemma, obviously, which means problems. And so let me go back to that last slide and demonstrate what I mean by the heuristics dilemma. Why is it a problem to think about business writing as these 6 rules? Well, first, if we think about follows the rules, we automatically have to think about whose rules or what rules. Are these rules written in policy and procedure, or are they unwritten rules that we're just supposed to understand? Is easy to read, we automatically have to think about is easy to read for who? Is it easy to read for everybody? Is it accessible, in other words? Is it usable by users with disabilities, for example? And so already we have to be thinking about how these little rules have lots of problems to them. Attracts the reader. Well, what if I have to say something in business that might be off-putting to readers? And then meets the reader's expectations. What if I have to communicate something that's unexpected? Can I still have good business writing? I would say yes. And so you see these rules start to be a little bit problematic. Clear and concise, efficient and effective, maybe we think about those as a little bit more straightforward. But in terms of conciseness, concision, what about a message that has to be long form or something that needs a lot of explanation and is efficient and effective? I think we think about that for all writing, which again, maybe that's why I put business in parentheses up top. But that's sort of what I want you to get thinking about in your first assignment on Canvas, which will be to write a text message from a position of leadership. It'll be a text message that is something unexpected. It'll be something that doesn't have many rules to it, and it will be something that might not be attractive to the readers that you want to address. And so we'll end our first lecture there, and we'll pick up next time with authentic authorship and how we present ourselves and our institutions through our business writing. Thanks.